Radio TV Phono Nut here, and in the past we've encountered record players with a 3-volt crystal cartridge. Most of these are what you would call a one-tube wonder, but the practice continued into the solid state era. But by the early 80s, crystal cartridges had basically stopped being used for newly manufactured equipment, and they were using ceramic low-output cartridges with a beefier amplifier. Well, the problem is 8 out of 10 times those crystal cartridges are going to be dead by now, and if you're lucky enough to find a new old stock one that actually still works, it's going to set you back a pretty penny, and it might not work for very long. And of course, new replacements haven't been made in over 40 years. So the way we've gotten around that problem was to build a preamp stage to where we could boost the output of a modern ceramic cartridge, which is typically about a half a volt up to the 3 volts needed for a one-tube wonder or a 2 or 3 transistor amplifier. And we've done that with a vacuum tube where space permitted, and the chassis had a hole on it for an extra tube socket, and we've also done it with a field effect transistor. But I'm always looking for other ways to accomplish things, so I found this schematic on the internet that somebody built for a preamp circuit for one of these little RCA 45 players that uses a couple of 2N2222 transistors. I built this circuit. Don't waste your time building it because it didn't work. Now, we learned about transistors and such whenever I was taking electronics 25 years ago, but I probably need to brush up on some of that. But when I was showing this schematic to some people in some of the Facebook groups, they were all in agreement that this is a very poor design, and it could very easily not work based on the transistors because it's a very finicky circuit. So I think we're going to go back to our tried and true schematic that we use based on a field effect transistor. And another problem with this schematic here using regular bipolar transistors, it's not going to have the high input impedance that the FET or tube preamp circuit would have. So that's going to cut your bass response, which we really don't need. Now, on our FET schematic, we use the cathode of the output tube to power the thing. On this one, they're using a 9-volt Zener and a dropping resistor here to power the preamp circuit from B+. I'll have to say that's about the only part of this that worked right. Whenever I built this and tried it, all I got was very weak and distorted audio. Now we're going to look at the schematic that we've used before that works. Here's the schematic for the working circuit, and no, I did not come up with this on my own. This is something that somebody in one of the Facebook groups came up with a long time ago. Now, if you have a one-tube wonder that uses something like a 25L6 or a 25C5 or any of the other L6 or C5 varieties, there are a few things you need to do, if not already done, to the existing amp circuit before you proceed. Number one, you need to place a 0.01 microfarad cap across the primary of the audio output transformer. That's to cut down on oscillation. Number two, if one already is not present, you need to shunt a 22 or 33, 47, it's not that critical, electrolytic capacitor across your cathode resistor, which typically is 150 ohms. That's to filter the cathode voltage here to where you can have a steady DC voltage to power this little amplifier circuit here. Now, on some record players, they'll use something like a 50 EH5 tube, and that's supposed to be a slightly higher gain tube that uses a lower value cathode resistor. I haven't really tried this amplifier in one of those yet. If I put this circuit in one of those types of amplifiers, I would probably be better off going with the Zener diode trick to power it instead of upsetting the value of the cathode resistor for the EH5 type tube. But we'll cross that bridge at a later date. Oh, and one other thing you need to do on your existing amplifier is, if one is not present, add a grid leak resistor between the control grid of your output tube and ground. On this schematic, they show a 270K, but 470K is generally customary for that application, and that's what I've been using. And then once you get it all put together, you'll notice this 4.7K ohm pot. It's connected between our source of the FET, and ground. What you do there is, whenever you build everything and turn the record player on and let it warm up, you measure the voltage at the test point here, which is the junction of this 100 ohm resistor and this 4.7K resistor and this 47 microfarad electrolytic. And then you take a note of that voltage, and then you measure the voltage here at the drain of the FET, and then you adjust this 4.7K ohm pot here until the voltage that you measure at the drain is exactly half of what you measured here at this test point. Now here's the schematic that I drew off of the one provided, and here's the base diagram of the FET that we're going to be using. Source, drain, and gate from left to right, viewed from the bottom. And the original design called for an MPF 102, which is an obsolete part now. I'm going to try a 2N5484 in this application, and hopefully that'll work out okay. Okay, we're on the road to success, and I only made one boo-boo with the construction of this, and I'll explain that here shortly. So we checked our voltage at our test point here. We read about 6.1 volts, and the object was to adjust this 4.7K pot until we read half of that on our drain connection on our FET, which would have been about 3 volts. Well, I was getting about 5.5 volts no matter what setting this pot was adjusted to, and it worked, but we had distorted audio because the bias was screwed up. I found out the problem is this wiper is supposed to be connected to the other end of this pot, which goes to ground, and I thought I had it connected, but as it turns out, I didn't. You know how it is when you're trying to make a solder blob happen. It usually don't work, but when it's something that you don't want a solder blob to take place on, that's when it happens with ultimate ease. So we got that straightened out, and we were able to adjust this voltage on our drain here to about 3 volts, and now we have success. Now, as far as the 0.01 microfarad cap across the output transformer, you might remember, and I'll show you the schematic shortly, where originally this had a 10 meg tone control pot in the input side of the amplifier with a switch on the rear of the pot for the motor. Well, that pot was bad, and I think I ended up using like a 50K pot that had a switch on it, because 10 meg pots with a switch are not easy to come by. And what I did was I connected a capacitor to the plate of the output tube, and then the other end of the capacitor to the pot, and then the other end of the pot to B+. Well, in this situation, it seemed to work okay, but whenever I turned the tone control to its extreme treble position, we had distorted audio. So with the tone control and all still in place, I put the .01 cap from plate to B+, and that cleared up our audio some, but now we have a hum at the extreme treble position. So I think we're going to have to reconfigure our tone control to go back on the grid side of the audio output tube, or at the front end of the record player where the cartridge goes into the preamp stage, and put the .01 cap between plate and B+. But right now I'll show you, or rather let you hear where we stand at this point. This thing gets actually too loud now with this 1-volt cartridge.
Bears, Bibles, and a Boy. Memories of the
this record is cut off center.
Roberts. Copyright 1961 by W. Company Incorporated. Recorded in 6 records for the Library of Congress in the studios of the American
position. Actually, all this is a treble cut control.
Intended solely for the use of the blind, with the kind permission of the publisher.
And there it is at the
Norton
treble position, and I am detecting a little distortion.
In this book, Mr. Roberts tells of his experiences as a small boy.
And that's so loud that we're getting some feedback. So,
born in 1882 at Brant Lake, Warren County, New York.
Probably what I'm going to end up doing with this is I'm going to remove the single-sided 1 mil 1-volt cartridge, and we're going to put a standard half-a-volt cartridge with an LP78 flip stylus. No, we won't be playing 78s on this, but a 3 mil stylus is more appropriate for the old talking book records before microgroove came out, so we can put a cartridge with a flip stylus in it and be able to play the newer 33 1/3 RPM microgroove talking books as well as the older wide groove records. Now technically, I believe the wide groove records were played with a 1.8 mil stylus, but the closest thing to that today would be a single 2 mil stylus, which is an all-speed compromised needle. But whenever I tried a 2 mil stylus on this particular cartridge holder, it played the older style records okay, but I could see it gouging the grooves in the microgroove style records. And I know of no flip stylus with a 2 mil and a 1 mil and a 2 mil on it, so it's just going to have to be a 3 mil for the older wide groove. So here's the completed circuit board. It's kind of sloppy looking, but it gets the job done. Now, one other thing I need to do, but it's probably not going to happen in this video, is we need to mount this to the chassis. And this is one of those situations where I knew there was something I forgot to obtain. We need to get some standoffs and some appropriate bolts and nuts to where we can just bolt this directly to the chassis here with the standoffs, of course, to raise this up from the chassis where the bottom of the circuit board won't short out to the chassis. We don't really want this dangling for the long term, but once we get that in there, it'll look a lot neater. So here's the schematic to this, and I'll try to go over this with you. Alright, the low side of the cartridge goes to chassis, which is isolated from B- by that .04 capacitor right there. And then the high side of our cartridge goes down here to one end of this 10 meg, they call it a Z taper potentiometer. That's our tone control. The high side of the cartridge also connects to one end of this .0004 microfarad capacitor, or 400 microfarad, and then the other end of that capacitor connects to the other end of this tone control, and then the center of our tone control connects to the top end of that tone control as well, And then the top end of that tone control comes down here and goes into our volume control, which is a standard 500 k ohm pot, also with a Z taper. And then the bottom of our volume control goes to B minus, and then the wiper of the volume control goes straight into the control grid of the audio output tube. So what we're going to do is we're going to put our 0.01 cap across this transformer primary, and then we're going to do some experimentation with this tone control. We'll try to find something. I would like to have it fixed like it was originally from the factory, but like I said, 10 meg pots are kind of hard to locate, especially with a switch, and I'm not paying $60 for one on eBay. That's not going to happen. But we might end up just having to put the tone control here off of the control grid of the audio output tube. Okay, I have some wonderful news. I did a little more digging around on eBay, and I found a 10 megohm Claristat potentiometer with a switch for a reasonable price. And they claim it's new old stock, and I believe it is because they show close-up pictures of the part, and I can't see any evidence of anything ever having been soldered to the terminals. And I can also tell from the close-up pictures that it's a 10 meg pot, and it just so happens that Claristat is who made the original, and this pot looks very much like what came out of it. So now we're at the mercy of the post office, and you know how that goes. But when it does arrive, whenever that is, we can wire our tone circuit back like it was originally. So in this particular case, our cartridge, of course, in tone control and volume control will be ahead of the preamp, and then the output of the preamp will go to pin 5 of the 50L6 audio amplifier tube. And then in addition, we now have a 470K resistor connected between pin 5 and circuit ground, and then we will have our 0.01 microfarad cap shunted across the primary winding of the audio output transformer, and that should restore performance back to something similar to what it was whenever it was new. Now, I can tell you the new ceramic cartridge that we'll be using will have a broader frequency response than what came out of it. The old crystal that came out of there was probably good for, about 50 cycles up through about 4,000 cycles maybe, which would generally be adequate for voice. But the ceramic cartridge that we use will be a bit wider than that. And like I said, I'm probably eventually going to install something like a fan steel P228 or a P226 that has an LP and 78 flip needle. Not because we're going to be playing 78s, the speed's not available on this, but 3 mil is somewhat close to the diameter needed for the old talking books from about 1934 up until about 1953 when they switched over to microgroove format. So, I guess right now we can go ahead and put our bypass cap across the transformer and use it without a tone control, but pretty much we're in limbo until that tone control arrives, and knowing the post office like we do, that's probably going to take a lot longer than it should. Okay, I've turned the screen magnification off so you can better see the whole schematic in the shot. I'll have to say, when I first got this talking book machine, and opened it up and discovered what basically amounts to a cheap kiddie record player, one-tube wonder amplifier, I was very shocked, because most of the talking book machines that I've seen were built like a tank, Most of them even had power transformers in the amplifier, and all of them had at least a two-stage amplifier. Now, there were some talking book machines made prior to World War II that had series string, power transformerless amplifiers with a universal AC or DC motor. In fact, I believe I have one of those machines somewhere that has a switch on it you can flip for AC or DC operation. And I can understand why they made such a machine, not only to cut cost, but back then there were some parts of the country that ran on DC supply lines, so obviously an AC operated machine wouldn't fare too well with that. And then I know of one other machine that was made, besides this one, that was made after World War II ended, that used a series string chassis, but at least that one had a two-stage amplifier, and we'll look at that schematic in just a minute. But this one here, for the exception of the goofy tone control circuit, this is basically just a cheap kiddie record player phonograph amplifier that was used for several decades. Now here's the other series string talking book machine. This was a Model B, which I believe was made in 1954 and 55, and I believe it was also the last model to use octal tubes, 12SQ7, 50L6, and a 35Z5, so basically the audio circuit of a 5-tube AM radio or a better quality suitcase portable record player. This one also has the tone control circuit at the cartridge input, but it's wired a little bit differently than the other one. And this one also has what looks like a negative feedback circuit from an extra winding on the secondary of the output transformer going back over here to our 12SQ7. And this did use a 1-volt ceramic cartridge originally, and the reason for that feedback circuit is to cut down on distortion, but it also decreases your gain a bit too. But with a 1-volt cartridge, this is plenty hot enough for a talking book record. Now the model that came after this, the Model D, went back to using a power transformer and miniature tubes, I believe a 6AV6, a 6AQ5, and a 6X4 rectifier. Now let's see if I can find a schematic for one of the 1960s tube. Oh, I hit the button by mistake there. Let's see if I can find a schematic for one of the 1960s era tube type talking book machines, which was probably one of the best talking book record players that they ever offered at any time. Here's the schematic for an American Printing House for the Blind Model 64 talking book machine, and this uses the exact same amplifier as the one that you could borrow from the talking book library. The one from APH was one that you could purchase outright if you wish to own your own equipment. And I found late 64 date codes in this machine, and you can tell that it was originally set up with a 2-speed motor, 16 and 33, but it looks like at the last minute they added a 3-speed motor to play 8 16 and 33 RPM records. But this one here uses a 12AX7, which is a dual triode, and then it uses a 6CM6 for the audio output tube, which was used, I believe, as a vertical output tube in some black and white televisions. And I suspect the reason they used a 6CM6 was because those were probably a lot cheaper than something like a 6BQ5 would have been. And then we have a 6X4 rectifier. And we have an equalization circuit on the front end to optimize the sound for talking book records. And then we have our, like I said, our 12AX7, which provides 2 triodes of amplification. And then we have our feedback circuit here from the output back to the one of the triode sections of that 12AX7, and the reason they made these amplifiers a bit hot is to compensate for the often lower output of a 16 RPM record, and especially on an 8 RPM record. As far as sound quality goes, the 33 RPM record sounded the best, and the 16 RPM record sounded pretty good for voice, but the 8 RPM records often left a lot to be desired, especially those later 9-inch flexible discs. Those really sounded like crap. But as far as a talking book record player, you're not going to find one that sounds any better than this one. After this, when they went to solid state in about 68, then everything just pretty much went downhill. And the last talking book record player from the 90s sounds like a tin can. Here's the schematic for a Sandwick Bowen built machine from 1947 or so. These were available both for purchase, and the Library of Congress also bought these machines for loaners. And this one here, as you can see, we have our volume control in the front end, and the output of that is capacitively coupled to the grid of this preamp tube, which is what, a 6SF5. And then we have our tone control on the control grid of the 6V6 output tube. And then we have a feedback circuit here. And on this one it's a little bit different. We have a voltage divider resistor network here between the plate of the output tube and B+, and we have our feedback line coming off of the junction at those two resistors, and it comes back and goes through another resistor back over here to the plate. That's where the plate of the preamp tube is getting its voltage. And then we have this coupling capacitor right here. So yeah, that one's a little bit weird, but this was probably the best talking book machine made during the 1940s. This one's got an 8-inch speaker in the lid, and it uses an Astatic B2, I believe that's what it uses, crystal pickup cartridge. And here's the schematic for the Model D machine from 1957, which was the first with 2 speeds. I think, except for some slightly different values on the cartridge input, it's basically the same amplifier with a 12AX7 and 6CM6 that was used all the way up through the Model AE4 machine, which was, I believe, discontinued in 1968 and replaced by a plastic case solid state job, the AE5 and AE5A. Now, to be fair, that first solid state plastic machine was not a bad machine, and then the AE6, A70, and A71 were very similar. They were okay, but after that, things just really started sliding. And by the mid-70s, they started slowly phasing out records and replacing them with cassettes, but it took them until the beginning of 2001 to completely phase out the last talking book magazines on 8 RPM 9-inch flexible disc. Now here is a schematic. Yes, this is the one. This machine here, I realize this is not very clear. This one here actually has a magnetic cartridge in it, and it's not a GE variable reluctance cartridge. It's some kind of oddball 1940s cartridge with a permanently attached stylus. And we did a video on this machine. It's called American Foundation for the Blind Sonograph, and it's actually about the size of a little kitty 78 RPM phonograph, but it runs at 33 and uses a magnetic cartridge. So how weird is that? So yeah, this machine that you're seeing now is a Model E1 in a wooden case. I think technically that was the first solid-state machine introduced in about '66, but I don't think they made very many of those. That was a very expensive machine to manufacture. The chassis wired point to point, and I've got a couple of them actually, and both of them had problems with the auto stop mechanism where the tone arm would shut the machine off at the end of the record. That could have been the reason why those were discontinued and not very many of them were made, and they just kept on with the tube models until 1968 when the AE5 and the subsequent AE5A were introduced. And as you can tell, that's in a plastic case. And then came the AE6, A70, and A71, which were all very similar, I think, except for the case color. That's an A71 right there. And that blue one is in a smaller plastic case and is an A72. And then the brown one is an A73. And by the way, by the 70s, the model number designates the year. And then the green one is an A74. The yellow one is an A75. I think that was the first one to use an integrated circuit amplifier. The older ones used discrete components. And then the orange one is an A76. And then the beige one is an A77 that used a redesigned motor board that was made out of plastic instead of fiber board. And that one also has an automatic cutoff switch, as does the red A78, the green A79, and the brown A80. And after the A80, there were no new talking book machines made until about 1990, until they came out with the A1 and then the CT1, which was a combination record player and cassette player. For that decade there, they just kept recycling older machines into circulation. And you can see that's what the one looks like closed up. And here's a picture of a 1940s era talking book machine, maybe late 30s, that I found on eBay. And I stole the picture off of eBay. I've never seen this machine. I have no idea who made it. It looks like they just adapted a wooden case consumer phonograph to run at 33 RPM. I can kind of tell that says property of U.S. government under the magnifier, but I can't make out the rest of it unless that says for use of the blind, but that's just strictly a guess. And there's the model A1. That particular model's from 1994. On that one, you press the tone arm down and swing it towards the edge of the record, and then when it hits the edge of the record, you release it and it starts playing. Plays 8, 16, and 33 and uses a belt drive turntable with a DC motor. Like I said, very, very crappy sounding audio on these. And there's a model CT1. I think that one's from about 93. That has the built-in auto-reverse 4-track tape player that will play 1 7/8 or 15/16 inches per second. And then we have the 3-speed record player that has forward and reverse for both records and cassettes, which, as you might expect, that's not very good for the record. The tape player on this actually sounds pretty good, but the record player sounds very similar to that A1 machine, not very good at all. And there was a rechargeable battery option for the combination machine, but it's a specialized battery and good luck on finding one today. Even if you found one, it would probably be dead from age. Here's a picture of that machine that I think has the series wired amplifier in it from before the war. It's going to be late 30s, early 40s. If I remember right, it uses something like a 25 Z6 or Z5 rectifier in a 41 or 42 output tube and a 75 for a preamp stage. And I believe that's the cartridge, the static B2 cartridge that's laid on the turntable platter that's bad. I believe that was what the showstopper was on me fixing this, because trying to substitute another type of cartridge in that tone arm would be very difficult. And if I remember correctly, that's the switch right there to switch the motor between AC operation or DC operation. And I think this one plays 33 and 78, so they were nice enough to include 78 so you could enjoy your home music records on this too. Now, some of the later 16 and 33 machines actually had four-speed motors in them, but they had a stop pin to prevent the lever from being moved to the 45 or 78 positions. But then people figured that out and removed the turntable platter and busted off the stop pin and had a four-speed record player. Okay, so I guess you've seen enough old talking book players and seen enough schematics, so let's get back to trying to get our test subject of this video taken care of. Now, I guess I can show you this one before we call it a night. This is a model U10, which I believe was the very first talking book machine from 1934. Now, this model here contains an AM radio as well as a record player that will play 33, 78, and 24 RPM. Although I don't think it has a designated click stop for 24. You basically have to set it to 33 and adjust the pitch control for proper speed, but 24 RPM was the talking book speed used in the UK for a good number of years, and I think they included the speed on earlier American issued machines in case libraries borrowed books or whatever from the UK, they would have a way to play them in the United States. But this one here uses a horseshoe magnetic type of pickup, and that wire coming out the front of the control panel is the antenna for the radio, and the radio dial has braille markings on it. And I do believe this one also uses a series string chassis and has a switch to allow the motor to operate on either AC or DC, and then it has about a 5 or 6 inch speaker in the lid of the machine. But yeah, one of these days we really need to get that one out and try to get it operational again. Well, my 10 meg pot finally showed up. It was supposed to have been here like I believe Monday of the week, and keeping in normal United States Postal Service fashion, it was in transit to next facility, arriving on time until Monday. And then, of course, it was nowhere near being on the truck for delivery. And then the next update was in transit to next facility, arriving late. Well, you think I hadn't already figured that out? So this went on until through Wednesday, and I thought, well, maybe I'll get it tomorrow, Thursday. And then I get on Facebook and see where the mail's not going to run because of Jimmy Carter's funeral. And that sent me into orbit. And then I made some crack remark on social media about, well, tonight's burning question: are they going to run the mail on Friday, or are they going to take another day off so Jimmy Carter can screw up America 2 days in a row after his death? And then I had a couple of people jumping on me, telling me how disrespectful I was. And under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't care that the post office closed on a president's funeral day, but the post office is a jacked up mess. They can't do anything right. They get days off every time somebody farts, and then they get another day off for Jimmy Carter's funeral. And I can promise you that none of those postal workers were mourning the death of Jimmy Carter. So the pot finally came in today, Saturday. I installed it in the record player, and guess what? I have no tonal range. I did everything nice and neat, got it in here, and then I have no tonal range. So now I've got to pull everything out and find out why. Did they send me a bad pot? The only thing different than what the schematic calls for is that tonal capacitor was a 400 picofarad. I had a 390. I hit the button again by mistake. But that shouldn't make a hill of beans bit of difference. In fact, I even jumped it with a bigger capacitor and I still had no tonal range. So I'm thinking this pot's probably bad, and I should have checked it before I put it in there. I just took for granted that since it was a new device, then it was okay. But it may very well not be. But given no more than I paid for it, it would probably be more trouble than it's worth to pack it up and send it back and get my money back. I don't know how well this is showing up on camera, but to my eyes, that says 10 ohms. That should be 10 megohms. Unless this is one of those old pots, something just hit me. And I'll explain in a minute. When I measured this pot, it reads 11K ohms. So technically, this was probably a 10K pot. But it says 10 ohms on the pot itself. And that's where the brainstorm just hit me. If you look at a lot of 1930s and early 40s radio schematics, they'll have a resistor marked, for example, 470 ohms. And that has confused a lot of people because they think ohm means megohms. Well, in modern day electronics it does, but back in the 30s and 40s that wasn't necessarily the case. Ohm meant 1000, so that resistor on a schematic that was marked as 470 ohms, or more likely back then it would be 500 ohms. Instead of being a 500 megohm resistor, it was a 500 k ohm resistor. And I think what's taking place with this pot is, even though it says 10 megohms, or 10 ohms, excuse me, it's actually a 10 k ohm potentiometer. So we're just right back to square one on this. So that confused me, and it confused the seller on eBay, evidently, which probably is not. I'd have to look at everything else they've got for sale, but they're probably not a dedicated electronics person. They're probably just some A to Z flipper that found some potentiometers and some junk and put them up on eBay and just saw where it was marked as 10 ohms, so they assumed it was a 10 megohm pot, but obviously not the case. So either this pot was made back when they meant for the ohm designation to actually mean 1000, or this was a Friday job that got misstamped. But either way, it's very aggravating because I wanted to get this wrapped up today, and after waiting an excessive amount of time for the mail to run to get the thing, only to have it finally show up and it be something I can't use, and now I've got to go through all this hassle again to try to find a correct part. And I'm not paying some ludicrous amount for one on eBay if this thing never has a working tone control. And it's times like this when I miss the local parts house, because they still had all kind of old goodies like this down there. And if I needed a 10 megohm pot, I could go down there and tell the old guy what I needed, and he'd go over to the cabinet and build me one with a switch on it and the correct shaft, and then he would test it to make sure it was good, and then I'd be in business. But now we have no more parts house because of disposable electronics and with everything that's shut down during COVID, so now I'm forced to order everything, which can be a pain in the butt sometimes. Now, on the subject of talking book machines, something else I wanted to talk about. I'm sure some of you have seen that movie, Places in the Heart, that has a a blind gentleman on it. I've never watched it in its entirety, but my mother's had watched it 2 or 3 times when she was alive, and she told me about the blind guy with the talking book record and how the kids got into his room and scratched one of his records, and he about went into orbit over it. Well, I was talking to a blind friend of mine recently who collects and services antique radios and clocks and such, and that subject of that movie came up, and he had seen it, but of course with no vision he couldn't tell exactly what kind of record player it was, so he asked me if I ever got a chance to see the movie to try to figure out what kind of record player it was. He wanted to know what kind of talking book machine it was. Well, I found the movie on YouTube, and I bounced around it until I found the scene with the record player in it. A couple of discrepancies there as far as for talking book use. Number one, the record player used is not a genuine talking book machine. It's just a generic wind-up portable record player with an acoustic reproducer on it. Now, back in the 30s, there were some genuine talking book record players that had a wind-up spring-driven motor, but they used a regular tone arm with a high-output cartridge that could drive a set of headphones. And then the other discrepancy in that movie, I could tell by how fast the record was turning that it was a standard 78 RPM. It was not a 33 1/3 RPM record. And to my knowledge, there were never any 78 RPM talking books. I mean, that would just not be practical. Can you imagine how many records it would take to fill up a book at 78 RPM apiece? Back then, I think the 12-inch 33 1/3 RPM wide groove records only played for like 12 or 15 minutes a side, and some of those books took up something like 50 records, so yeah, it just would not have been practical to put talking books on 78 RPM records. But as far as that movie, that was just a case of the prop department just using whatever they could get their hands on. And in all fairness, unless you were someone who was visually impaired that had used the talking book program back during that time, the average person would see that record player in that movie and they wouldn't know the difference. And in today's world, 2025, I doubt there's very many people left, if anybody at all, who was around during the mid-30s when talking books were first introduced. Well, they might have been a child during the mid-30s, but back then, talking book service was only available to adults, so somebody in 1935 who was 21 years old, they would have been born in 1914, and like I said, I doubt there's that many people left, if any at all, in the United States that were around back when the talking book program was first introduced. But yeah, I know movie shows and movie producers and such, they're bad about using unperiod correct stuff and stuff that's obviously wrong. Something that I noticed a while back that was obviously wrong was an early episode of Mannix, I believe from 1967, and they showed looked like about a 9 or 12-inch portable black and white TV with a picture on the screen that was in color. Now, in 1967, to my knowledge, there were no 9-inch color TVs, and the only color TVs in that time period that were small screen color were the 11-inch GE Portacolors. So that was obviously a screw-up. You know, using a 9-inch black and white TV and making it out to be a color TV when at the time there were no 9-inch color TVs on the market that I'm aware of. So now I guess we're back to the old drawing board on this. I will try to come up with a 10 meg pot for this somewhere that's actually a 10 meg pot that won't break the bank. See, this is the kind of crap you see on eBay, a potentiometer that was obviously cut out of something. You can see the solder still on the terminals. No way of knowing if it's good or not. $50 plus shipping. And that's just what we're not going to go with. Now what? See, here's another one, 10 megohm potentiometer, $37. That one, I'd have to look at it closer to see if it'd been soldered to, but still, that's a little bit ridiculous. And something else that sucks about this is the part that we installed was physically identical to what came out of it, so it looked more obvious that it was not a replacement than what it would have looked like if I'd have put some modern something from China Incorporated in there. The main thing, see here, oh, now we get 2 for $100. 2 more for $100. See, this is the, oh, that one's only $27.55. That one's $37, and none of these have switches on them. And like on this packaging, they spell it out, MEG. They just don't put 10M. It's 10.0 MEG. So that should definitely mean 10 megohms, as in 10 million ohms. And yeah, that $37 pot, it's definitely a used one. You can tell that there's solder on the terminals, which means they cut it out of something. And these people who will take a piece of equipment that's probably otherwise restorable and chop it to pieces and attempt to sell each individual little part out of it for some ludicrous amount of money really chap my butt as well. But in the future, I'm not buying any more potentiometers advertised as simply 10 ohm. It's either going to have to be 10 MEG ohm, or they're going to have to show a picture of it with a meter across it where I can see that it's actually 10 megohms and not 10 k-ohms. So yeah, once again, just another waste of time and money here. Yeah, back in the 30s and 40s, I think the reason they used M to designate 1000 is because M is the Roman numeral for 1000, so that's what they did for a lot of years. Now, on the schematic, we know they mean megohm because if you look at the volume control pot, they have that listed as 0.5 M. Well, you wouldn't have a 500 ohm pot and the volume is a volume control in the grid circuit of the tube here. That would just kill everything. So we know that 0.5 M in this case means 500K, so it stands to reason that the 10 M for the tone control is 10 megohm. And then let's see if we can find any other clues. And then on the notes on the schematic, they tell you by the omega symbol means ohms, K equals 1000 ohms, M equals 1 million ohms. So that's how we know that what they actually mean on this schematic. Couple of clues actually, what I just said about the volume control pot, and they actually spell it out in the notations on the schematic here. U.S. Recording Company, 1121 Vermont Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C., Model S, checked by so-and-so, drawn by so-and-so, drawing number 195-2-1949, Panacoustic. Negative temperature coefficient resistor, 200 ohms at working current. That's the reason this takes so long to warm up, because they have that in the filament string, but its purpose was to extend tube life. Now, is there any other interesting facts about this schematic? No, everything else looks pretty much standard fare. Okay, here is the schematic for the Model B talking book machine. It's about 5 years newer than what we're working on, and this one has a 2-stage amp, but that's really beside the point. This one also has the tone control right here at the front end, ahead of the volume control. But in this case, instead of having the capacitor shunted across the tone control, they have the wiper and the low side of the tone control tied together, and then there's a capacitor between those points and B- or circuit ground, and then they have the high end of the tone control connected to the hot side of the cartridge, as well as the high end of the volume control here. And this tone control is a 500K. That will be much easier to find than a 10 meg pot. In fact, I can probably, if I do some digging, find something like that around here. And then, of course, our volume control is a 500K wired in standard fashion with the low side to B-, the wiper going to the grid of the 12SQ7, and the high side, like I said, connected to the cartridge, and the high side of the tone control. So I'm just trying to weigh our options here, because I'm just really getting tired of fooling with this thing, and I don't think it's going to make much difference in sound quality which tone control scheme we use. So I'm probably going to end up digging up a 500K pot with a switch on it preferably, and just slapping it in here and letting it go. Okay, we're about done, and the way we've done this is I dug around in my junk and I found a brand new 500K ohm potentiometer with a switch. Unfortunately, it's a more modern Chinesium variety, but it's all we have to work with right now. The shaft on it is a knurled shaft, not a solid shaft like what was on here, and it's slightly shorter than what was originally on here, but I was still able to attach our knob to it. So we reconfigured the tone control circuit like what's in the Model B machine. And I think I've already said, but in case I didn't, most likely the reason they went with 10 meg ohm tone control is, with this machine having been made shortly after the war ended, they probably got a heck of a deal on 10 meg pots that there was not a lot of demand for. So rather than pay more money for the 500K ohm pots, they went with the 10 meg and figured out a way to make it work for them. But seeing as how those are basically unobtainable anymore, we had to go with what we could get. So there's our little preamp board, and all of these modifications are 100% reversible. In case anybody wanted to have the original cartridge rebuilt and take this machine back to original form, I need to find that cartridge and put it with the machine, but I really can't think of any worthwhile reason why anybody would want to do that, because as it is, it will play newer records without tearing them up. And there's not that many wide groove 33 1/3 RPM talking book records left, so it's more useful in its current configuration than what it would be taking it back to its original form. Okay, so I'm going to put this back together, and we're going to give a little demonstration, and at the end of this video I'm going to provide some schematics for you to peruse. The first schematic will be the one of this machine. The second schematic will be of the Model B machines. You can take a look at the tone control circuits and see how I changed them around. And then I'm going to show the schematic for that little 2-transistor preamp that I recommend you not try to build, because I did and it didn't work. And then I'm going to show you the schematic of the FET preamp stage, and just remember what I told you about the modifications. If you go with the FET stage, you're going to have to put a 0.01 microfarad cap across your output transformer primary. You're going to have to add an electrolytic bypass capacitor for your cathode on the output tube if one is not present. And you're going to have to add a 470 k ohm grid leak resistor for the output tube if one is not already present. And those modifications apply to amplifiers using the octal-based L6 tube varieties and the 7-pin miniature C5 varieties. For the EH5 varieties, that is designed to use a lower value cathode resistor, and we're going to have to come up with another way to power our preamp stage if you stick with that tube, and we will visit that in another video. I think I know a good way to do it, but we're not going to discuss that in this video. So let's put this back together and let you hear how it sounds, and then we're done with this. Oh, and one other thing. Whenever I was working on this the first time with the other preamp circuit that didn't work off camera, I accidentally pulled the wires out of the original speaker. I think the terminal board was loose anyway, and I just didn't catch it. This had a 4-inch speaker in it originally. I found a 5-inch pincushion frame, and the way they have these mounting centers, the 5-inch pincushion frame speaker lined up, but this speaker has an output transformer mounted on it. But this amplifier has an output transformer on the chassis, so I just disconnected the secondary of the output transformer on the speaker. I didn't want to try to remove it since it's riveted in place, and I didn't want to take a chance of busting the cone. So down the road, I would like to find a conventional 5-inch 3.2 ohm speaker without a transformer to put in here. But before I put this 5-inch speaker in here, I put a more modern 8-ohm 4-inch speaker in here that I had on hand, and the volume wasn't nearly as loud, so that just proves that speaker impedance does matter, and as does the type of speaker, as in the older speakers from the tube era are more efficient, therefore they get louder than a lot of the later speakers from the solid state era. And that's the reason it's a good idea to save any kind of old speaker that you find in an old piece of equipment that you part out, because good speakers are getting hard to come by. Alright, while we wait 10 minutes for the tubes to warm up, the only other thing I want to do regarding this is, like I previously mentioned, I want to put a cartridge in here with a flip Stylus so we can play the old wide groove records if we so desire. With our new tone control circuit, that does attenuate the signal just a little bit, so we might have to go with an 89T, but I'm going to try a Varco P226 and see how that goes. I think that will probably still give us enough output, but if it doesn't, then the 89T is an option. Even those are getting to be unobtainable these days, and whoever thought the day would come when an 89T cartridge would no longer be readily available.
Page 11, Padresky by Charlotte Kellogg. One never understood how the not very large dining room seated.
And as you can tell, the tone control is working.
The master at its head, happy and offering friends delicacies of his own growing. Polish cooks rival French chefs, their jellied fish and meats and exquisite sauces, their fabulous desserts.
Okay, here is another camera that I found in a box of junk that I obtained. This is an old Canon camera that's probably as old as the Fuji that I had. And we're just going to do a test on it and see how it does in comparison to the Fuji, which is what you've seen the rest of this video on. So you tell me what you think.
Wildlife at Your Doorstep by Glenn Rounds. Copyright 1958 by Prentice Hall, Incorporated. For the Library of Congress, in the studios of the American Printing House for the Blind, 1960. Intended solely for the use of the blind, with the kind permission of the publishers, Prentice Hall, Incorporated.
And that's our tone control range.
Read by Andy Chappelle. Wildlife at Your Doorstep. An almanac of curious doings dealing with wasps, spiders, snakes, toads, birds, ants, squirrels, and other kinds of small wildlife that can be found working at complicated trades within sight of my doorstep, with a few words also concerning old...
Alright, let's try another one.
The Nigger of the Narcissus.
Oh, am I going to get my channel terminated now?
Copyright 1897, 1914 by Doubleday, Page & Company. Copyright 1897 by Bachelor Syndicate. Recorded in 8 records for the Library of Congress in the studios of the American Printing House for the Blind, 1955. Intended solely for the use of the blind, with the kind permission of the publishers, J.M. Dent & Sons, Limited. Read by Livingston Gilbert.
That's our tone control.
Chapter 1. Mr. Baker, chief mate of the ship Narcissus, stepped in one stride out of his lighted cabin into the darkness of the quarterdeck. Above his head, on the break of the poop, the night watchman rang a double stroke.
Alright, that was wide open, and we're not getting the feedback now that we were getting before, so this tone control is attenuating the signal just enough to prevent that from happening.
And a lot of new men has come. They must be all there. Tell the bosun to send all hands aft, went on Mr. Baker. And tell one of the young...
Now on these, to make it easier for someone with no vision at all to use, we have these record guides at the rear of the turntable. They're just a couple of upright pieces of metal that you can slide the record back until they hit the guides, and then the record will be lined up over the turntable spindle. And to make it easier to place the tone arm on the first groove of the record, the tone arm rest has a rubber bumper on it, and it's just fixed to where all you've got to do is gently slide the tone arm down the side of the wrist, and it will land on the lead-in groove on the record.
The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Published by Random House, Incorporated. Copyright 1959 by Epstein and Carroll Associates, Incorporated. Recorded in 8 records for the Library of Congress in the studios of the American Printing House for the Blind, 1960. Intended solely for the use of the blind, with the kind permission of the estate of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Read by Livingston Gilbert. I have wrought my simple plan if I give 1 hour of joy to the boy who's half a man, or the man.
And that's our motor off on switch. They put that on there in case you needed to stop the record for any reason, and then you could restart it without having to wait on the tubes to warm up. Of course, when they went to the solid state machines in the late 60s, that was not necessary because the amplifier required no warm up. Now on this one we have that little bit of hum that you often get from cheaply designed amplifiers that are not well shielded, but that's just the way it is with this one. That's not going to really be heard that much when you're playing a record.
The boy. Chapter 1. There are heroisms all round us. Mr. Hungerton, her father, really was the most tactless person upon earth. A fluffy, feathery...
And you might be wondering why a record player for the blind would have a pilot indicator lamp on it. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. And yes, that is a valid question. Not everybody who signed up for the Talking Book program is totally blind. In fact, I suspect that most readers have some eyesight, but not enough eyesight to comfortably read a book that's in standard print. So in that case, you know, they could probably see the indicator light. And also, there are a lot of visually impaired people who live with people who are fully sighted, so even if someone was totally blind and living with someone fully sighted, that sighted person might walk by and notice the light and say, hey, Johnny left his talking book machine on, and go turn it off for him. And then also another reason for the light is they use those on the 35Z5 tubes. There was a tap on the tube for the pilot light, and the pilot light sort of helped preserve the tube heater. That's why they used to tell you on the 5-tube radios that when your pilot light burns out, replace it as soon as possible, because if you don't, the lifespan of your 35Z5 is going to be shortened from the turn-on surge, because usually they take the B+ off of the tap, the heater tap on the 35Z5. They take that voltage and feed it over to the plate, and that's the reason when there's a short in a radio with a 35Z5 tube, it blows the heater open. They're also using that heater as a fuse. I need to look at the schematic and see if that's what they're actually doing on this, but I'm sure they are.
All the stigmata of passion were there, but I was sadly conscious that up to now I had never found the literature. The Lost World, which is the first of a series of stories about Professor Challenger, was followed by The Poison Belt, The Land of Mist, The Disintegration Machine, and When the World Screamed. The End, recorded in the Talking Book Studios of the American Printing House for the Blind, Louisville, Kentucky, May 1960. Read by Livingston Gilbert.
Of Courage Undaunted, Across the Continent with Lewis and Clark by James Doherty. Copyright 1951 by James Doherty. Recorded in 4 records for the Library of Congress in the studios of the American Printing House for the Blind, 1959. Intended solely for the use of the blind, with the kind permission of the publisher, the Viking Press, Incorporated. Read by Milton Metz. Of Meriwether Lewis. Of Courage Undaunted, possessing a firmness of purpose which nothing but impossibilities could divert from its direction, careful as a father of those committed to his charge. Of Courage Undaunted, honest, disinterested, liberal, of sound understanding and a fidelity to truth so scrupulous that whatever he should report would be as certain as seen by ourselves. With all these qualifications as if selected and implanted by nature in one body for this express purpose, I could have no hesitation in entrusting the enterprise to him. The End. Recorded in the Talking Book Studios of the American Printing House for the Blind, Louisville, Kentucky, June 1959. Read by Milton Metz.
Okay, well that ought to about do it for this installment. So at the end of this video I'll post those schematics that I mentioned for your perusal, and then we'll see what else we can come up with later. And by the way, that last narrator, Milton Metz, me and someone on Facebook who lives in the Louisville, Kentucky area were discussing WHAS, and Milton Metz was, I believe, an announcer there at one time, and we were talking about how Clear Channel, also known as today as I think iHeartMedia or just Cheap Channel, how they got a hold of the station and basically ruined it. And in my opinion, they pretty much ruin everything they touch. I know there was a little station over in Alabama, the one that I've mentioned before, that was at 670. I was told that back in the 90s that Clear Channel offered the owner of that station a hefty sum, and he refused to sell it to them. Well, good for him, but the station still ended up getting ruined when the original owner died and his son took over operations and turned it into an automated black gospel format. But anyway, that's about all I've got for now. I hope you got something out of this. And I know the purist won't be too crazy about adding preamp stages to older phonographs, but in the cases of 3-volt crystal cartridges that are no longer being made, and with new old stock ones almost being unavailable, if you want these things to work to any degree of satisfaction, then you're going to have to come up with alternative means to make that happen, and building a preamp circuit is one of those means, and that's just the way it is. I wished it wasn't. I wished I could just go down to the parts house and buy a new production crystal cartridge, but we can't do that anymore because they're no longer made, even if we did have a parts house left. Alright, back to the old camera because we need to charge the batteries in the other two. Going slightly off topic as far as schematic diagrams and designing circuits and that sort of thing, I was looking at the online faculty and staff list for the local community college. I was just curious to see how many instructors are still there today that were there 25, 30 years ago whenever I was there, and unfortunately not very many. And it's also unfortunate that it does not appear that they have an electronics technology program anymore. Even though I'm a bit saddened by that, I'm not surprised by it because, number one, pretty much all of the consumer electronics have turned into disposable Chinesium, and the industrial and commercial stuff has gotten so specialized that you don't repair the equipment to component level. You just swap out a whole circuit board, or if something breaks, you just call in a technician that's specially trained by the company that sold the equipment, and they come and fix it. So it's really sad that these community colleges are dropping their electronics programs, and the high schools too. I think my high school dropped their electronics program in the early 2000s, and I know of another community college that dropped theirs in the early 2000s, so I don't know exactly when my local college dropped theirs, but they hung on longer than some did. Alright, here's a 10-inch 33 1/3 RPM talking book that obviously the tone arm guide won't work on that, but the turntable is the size of the record, so you can use the turntable to help guide you on the record placement on the 10-inch disc.
The Holy Bible, the Gospel according to Matthew, complete on 5 records. From the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, copyright 1952 by the Division of Christian Education, National Council of Churches, and used by permission. Recorded for the American Bible Society in the Talking Book Studios of American Foundation for the Blind, Incorporated. Read by Alexander Scorby. Chapter 1 through Chapter 4. Chapter 1. The Book of the Genealogy.
Oh, and something else, as far as the letterbox format that we're seeing on some of my recent videos, I went into Windows Movie Maker and I couldn't find any way to change that, and then I looked at some of my more recent videos over the past few months on YouTube, and it looks like YouTube might be doing that now with content that is not high definition. I'll look in the settings on YouTube, see if there's any way to change that, but if there's not, then it just is what it is. There's nothing I can do about it. And either I'm missing something, or there's not anything in Windows Movie Maker to change that. Alright, we have one of the old Wide Groove records. I think this is from 1939. Unfortunately, it's not a complete book, but we have a few of these records to use on these older machines. Now I'm going to show you what it sounds like with the 1mm Stylus. You're going to hear a good bit of noise.
This
20, The Country Beyond. For the first time, the ferret leveled his eyes at his companion.
As you can tell, the noise almost overrides the content. And a lot of that is probably due to this record being worn, but now I'm going to plug in the 2mm cartridge. If there's the 2mm cartridge, let's see what it sounds like.
Page 20, The Country Beyond.
That's better.
For the first time, the ferret leveled his eyes at his companion. They were mystifying eyes, never appearing to open fully, but remaining half closed.
And obviously this record is not cut as loud as some of the newer ones, so on that note, we probably need to keep the high output cartridge here. Our high output by today's standards, about 1 volt.
You see, he thinks he killed a man down south.
That's wide open.
The man lived. If you happen to see him at any time, give him that information, will you? He thrust his head and shoulders into the growing tunnel. Yes, I will. He knew Broth was lying. He also knew that back of the narrow slits of Broth's eyes...
Now, I'm not a fan of having to physically swap cartridges around, but 2mm is more in line with what needs to be used to play these types of records, and it's probably going to be so infrequent that I play these types of records that it won't be a big deal. So I'm probably just going to leave the cartridge in here, and I'll find a little small container with some padding in it to put the cartridge that's not being used in the container and keep it with the record player. And then if we ever on some rare occasion want to play one of these wide groove records, we'll have a way to do it. Now, there are some of those wide groove records on eBay right now, but my lord, the people selling them think they're gold, and some of them have been up there for years. That they haven't lowered the price on any of them. There's somebody on there from the UK that's selling a bunch of the 24 RPM records from the United Kingdom. Now, I don't know what size stylus those use, but they have those priced from like $600 up to over $1,000, which is nuts. And that's a classic example of just because it's old doesn't mean it's valuable. But these people on eBay think that just because something's old, then it's worth a ton of money. Old and rare does not equate to valuable. Demand does, and there's not a whole lot of demand for old talking book records, so therefore, the value is not there. I dare say probably the only people interested in them are a few people like me who have used them over the years and are aware of them. It's like I've said before, many fully sighted people are not even aware that such exist. And as far as that goes, there's even some blind people that are still not aware that such exists. So, there you go. Now, if I can find some of these older type records on eBay that are fairly priced, I might buy some of them, but I'm not paying $50 and up for these old records just to have them. That's just not going to happen. In fact, most of my talking book records were free from a gentleman who got them years ago from a blind school purge. He happened to be at the right place at the right time when they were getting ready to throw them in a dumpster. And he got them, and as he made copies of them for his own use, he sent me the records. Earlier I was talking about the dial lamp being a surge current limiter for the rectifier tube filament, and I'm looking at this schematic, and they do have the plate voltage taken from the center tap on the rectifier filament, so this is wired in such a way that excessive current is drawn, and it's going to blow this tap on the filament here. And then we have the number 47 dial bulb between pins 2 and 3 on the rectifier tube. And an old trick back in the radio repair days is when the rectifier tube was blown, and if you wanted to make the radio play in a pinch and didn't have a tube handy, you could jump pins 2 and 3 and get the radio to work again, but of course you would not have a dial light at that point. And I've been guilty of doing that myself a few times. And then in addition, we have this resistor here between the rectifier tube heater and the output tube heater. And this is not just a normal wire wound resistor. You could replace it with that and it would work fine, but this is a negative temperature coefficient resistor that measures 250 ohms at working current. Now if you take you can think of it this way, a degaussing thermistor and a color TV would be a positive temperature coefficient device, meaning it has a low resistance whenever it's cold, and then as it heats up, it increases in resistance. But in this case, when we turn the set on, at cold resistance, it reads a lot higher than 200 ohms, and then as the device heats up, the resistance goes down, and when everything is fully heated, it reads 200 ohms. Now, if that were to open, I could replace that resistor with a 200 ohm wire wound, but you wouldn't have that surge protection there at turn on, and that's the whole purpose of this, and that's the reason it takes the tubes an unusual amount of time to warm up. Since most of these machines, when they stopped working, were mailed back to the machine lending agency for repair, they were probably trying to put as many safeguards into the design as they could to make sure they lasted as long as possible without having to be returned for repair, as a means of not inconveniencing the borrower, as well as not overloading them with machines to be repaired. And this also has a 47 ohm resistor coming off of the cathode of the rectifier to our first filter capacitor. That's a surge current limiting resistor as well. And we have fuse protection. And they were nice enough to have a fuse clip in the lid of the machine to house a spare. So several modes of overcurrent protection here. Now, as far as our speaker, we have a headphone jack on this machine too, and whenever a set of headphones is plugged in, this contact on the headphone jack is moved to this position, which disconnects the internal speaker and shunts this 5 ohm 1 watt resistor across the secondary of the audio output transformer, and then your headphone will be connected across that resistor. And what that resistor does is absorbs most of the power there, so you won't have excessive volume through the headphones, because it's all being most of the power there is being dissipated by this resistor. If the resistor wasn't in place and you plugged a pair of headphones in, you would probably have excessive volume that might damage your hearing as well as the headphones. And also, if you plugged a pair of high impedance headphones into that jack, then that might not make things overly happy with this being a low impedance secondary winding. So that's another reason for that resistor, to provide a low impedance load for this secondary winding on the transformer, as well as reduce the volume level, since most of the power will be dissipated by that resistor, and therefore you can plug in a pair of headphones to this and not risk having excessive volume level. Okay, something I thought we'd do before we end this, and then I'll show you the schematics. Let's do an audio and video clip with the Fuji camera, and then we'll follow that with the Canon camera that I found in the box of junk, and then we will follow that with the best camera, the Kodak camera that was recently gifted to me. So here we go.
Bears, Bibles, and a Boy. Memories of the Adirondacks by Jesse David Roberts. Copyright 1961 by W.W. Norton and Company, Incorporated. Recorded in 6 records for the Library of Congress in the studios of the American Printing House for the Blind, 1961. Intended solely for the use of the blind, with the kind permission of the publishers, W.W. Norton and Company, Incorporated. Read by Andy Chappell. In this book, Mr. Roberts tells of his in Connecticut. While at South Meriden, he took postgraduate work at Wesleyan in social psychology and the philosophy of religion. He has also served for 8 years in the Home Study Department of Columbia University. Bears, Bibles, and a Boy is Mr. Roberts' first book, although he has written, long past midnight, grandmother tended her patient. She kept his feet warm with hot bricks and administered potions of steeped herbs and barks. Finally, after thrashing about with alternate chills and burning fever, grandfather dozed off from exhaustion. Grandmother also lay down to rest, but had hardly gone to sleep before she was awakened by an impatient pounding at the door. A man's voice shouted, "I found the tracks of a big bear and